Thank you for coming. We're ready to begin the next session of our talks, and Lindsay Savage is going to be the next presenter, and she is my student, so I'm very proud of Lindsay. She has done some good work for an applied statistics class and also independent study, but she wanted to do something that would also benefit JSU. And so one of the things that the Office of Planning and Research was looking at is our retention rate. And so she decided to focus in on transfer students and compare different traits and see how that could, what happened to these students as they went through the process and what factors contributed to their graduation. And so this is something that's very useful for JSU to know. So it's been some very good information. And so she's worked very hard on it, and so I'm proud of her and very pleased to announce her for her presentation. The top right one, and then there's a laser pointer on red.
See the left and right arrows at the bottom?
Right here?
The left and right arrows at the bottom?
The right arrow advances it, and then there's a red button that's a laser pointer.
So this area.
Yeah, you want to push the other one?
Is it plugged in?
I think so. Yeah, the one that's to the right.
The computer's,
These two
okay. Okay, got it.
Good.
My name is Lindsay Savage, and as Dr. Kay said, I did research on whether the people who transferred graduated more or the people who started at JSU graduated more. So my research question was, do transfer students have a higher graduation rate than non-transfer students? The purpose of this research was just to see whether, the transfer students, if they had a higher graduation rate, or if non-transfer students had a higher graduation rate. And this was also the year that JSU lowered the ACT score, so I wanted to see if that had a factor of non-transfer students who graduated and didn't graduate. So the possible bias was, of course, the year of the data, because it was when they lowered the ACT score. And also, most of the transfer students didn't have an ACT score, because because they were already at another college, they just let them enter without having their ACT score. Okay, here are some graphs. It shows the gender and their final GPA, and as you can see, females had a higher GPA than males did. And then with the ACT score, the GPA slowly gets higher as the ACT score got higher, but just because you had a high ACT score doesn't necessarily mean you had a high GPA. And then transfer students, they had a higher GPA than the non-transfer students. And also, as you would expect, people who graduated had a higher GPA than people who didn't graduate. And then the last one is the type that the students transfer from. I did the four-year university and a community college, and then some were unknown. Okay, this is just a box plot of the final GPA, and as you would expect, the graduated students had a higher GPA, and you can see it's significantly higher than the ones who didn't graduate. This is a little bit more complicated box plot. It had the graduated students, the transfer students, and their gender. So if you wanted to see the females who transferred and graduated, you just go, there's females, and then they transferred and graduated, and that's their box plot for their final GPA. This one I found interesting. It was a histogram of the ACT scores, and for JSU, the highest one was an ACT score of 19. So it seems like most students who came to JSU had around 19 or 20 ACT score. It'd be interesting to see maybe Auburn University or Alabama, see if their ACT scores were higher than JSU's. Okay, my first hypothesis test was comparing the final GPA with the transfer students graduated, and then the gender. The null was that there was no significant effect, and then the alternative was that there was a significant effect. If you look at the p-value, they were all 0.00, which is less than the alpha of 0.05, so that means that there was a significant effect for all three of them. So then I did some descriptive statistics to see what the effect was. The first one is the gender, and if you look at the mean, that is their final GPA. So the females had a higher final GPA than the males. The females had about 2.3 and the males had 1.9. And that's what we would expect from looking at the box plot. We kind of already figured that. And then this is with the transfer students. Their mean GPA was 2.3, while the non-transfer students' mean GPA was a 1.2. And again, we kind of expected that from the graphs we saw earlier. And this is for the graduated students. It just shows how much higher their mean GPA was than the ones who didn't graduate. Their mean GPA was 3.04, while the ones who didn't graduate was 1.76. So that's a big difference. Okay. And the second test I ran, it was still the final GPA with the transfer, graduated, and gender, but I did ACT score as a covariant. And it was still, the null was there is no significant effect, and the alternative was that there was a significant effect with the alpha of 0.05. So if we look at the p-values, they're still all zero. So that means everything's still significant, and even the ACT score had a significant effect on the final GPA. I then ran a two-proportion test comparing the transfer students and graduated students. If you look right here, this says about 22% of non-transfer students graduated, while 50% of transfer students graduated. And then the p-value was 0, so there is a significant effect. So we can say that transfer students had a higher graduation rate than non-transfer students. And then I did it for gender, and this is the females. About 36% of females graduated, while only 26% of males graduated. And the p-value is still significant because it's less than our alpha. So with that, we are able to say that females have a higher graduation rate than males do. And then the last one, the last two proportion tests I did was to compare the four-year universities and then the community college of the transfer students where they came from. And this says 53% who came from a four-year university graduated, while only 46% who came from a community college graduated. That is a little bit of a difference, but if you look at the p-value, it's 0.146, so it's not a significant difference. I then did a regression analysis to compare, to see how well the ACT score was as a factor, to see if it affected their final GPA. And it is, significant, but the R-square says it only determines about 12% of their GPA. And that's just the fitted line plot. So the conclusion is that the students who transferred from JSU have a higher graduation rate than non-transfer students. And also that females have a higher graduation rate than males. And then the ACT is a significant predictor of the final GPA, but it only explains about 12% of the variability in the scores. So some other research that we could do is maybe go to a different year where the ACT scores weren't lowered. We could either go back a few years or wait and try to do newer students, and just to see if the results are still the same. And then we could also compare JSU's retention rates to a similar universities to see if they're the same or if they're significantly different.